I do feel like because this industry is so hard and because the regulatory environment is so challenging and arduous, and we don't have the support and infrastructure that a lot of other industries have around it, you can lose sight of it. But when you drill into it, it's like what we're doing here could be truly fun. And so I think brands also have to keep reminding us of that. That's part of their job in our ecosystem. And that comes in the form of a retail experience or in the products you're selling on the shelves.
All right, welcome back to High Touch, the podcast where we explore how cannabis brands and retailers are elevating the customer experience. I'm Jake.
And I'm Duffy, and today we've got a heavy hitter on the show, someone who's been shaping the cannabis space for over a decade. Our guest today is Emily Paxhia. She's the co-founder and managing partner at Poseidon, the OG cannabis investment fund. She's been backing cannabis companies since 2013, which is way before it was cool. And she's got this extremely sharp point of view on what makes a brand or a dispensary actually resonate with customers.
Emily's got a background in brand strategy. She's worked with everyone from Pepsi to HBO before jumping into cannabis. And she doesn't just write checks. She's in the room with the founders, helping to shape how these brands show up. Also probably worth noting, Poseidon, Emily's fund, is an investor in our company, Sparkplug. So we've had the privilege of seeing her thought process and support firsthand. This conversation is going to go deep on cannabis retail, brand loyalty, lounges, experience design, and what Emily sees coming next. So Emily, welcome to High Touch. We're stoked to have you.
Thanks so much for having me and for the introduction. It was fun to hear some of my old things that I was participating in. I mean, I'll just say I was involved in a couple of things such as Portlandia getting put on the air, and I know workaholics. Yeah,
Wow.
Nice.
I'm a
and then
huge Portlandia fan. That's incredible.
put a bird on it. And then, of course, definitely a lot of consumer stuff. So I worked with PepsiCo, very familiar with the competitive drink category and from everything from shelf stable to the cooler section and fashion. Yeah. So, and now cannabis. So glad to be here.
Awesome. We'll jump into it. I was reading about some of the projects that you've worked on and some of the other interviews that you've done. And in one interview that you were raised in a just say no household. And obviously you're out here as one of the first institutional cannabis investors. And I'm curious what shifted your thinking, if there's like a moment that you can recall back to that changed your frame of mind.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I grew up in a house where drinking was not a thing. And if anyone ever went on my Instagram page, they would see a picture of my dad at Woodstock. So he was definitely, he preferred cannabis. And Morgan and I, my brother, kind of developed an affinity or kind of like an open thought process around cannabis when our dad passed away in 1996. But prior to that was a hospice nurse raising kind of a palliative care consideration, more as almost a friend at that point about cannabis versus all the pharmaceutical drugs. And yet at the same time, I was in DARE and the president of the DARE group in my high school. Look, I was a joiner. I was also the president of my high school at that time. And it was really just to get out of Buffalo, New York. I love Buffalo. I'm a big Bills fan, but I had aspirations to travel far and wide and to become a business lady. My mom always used to tease me about it. She thought it was really funny because it was like I was born with a briefcase. But I feel like the dare thing was like we even did a dance. Betty Aldworth from SSDP and I used to, or well, she at the time was at SSDP. She and I used to talk about our dare dances and it did cognitive dissonance for me because the campaign tactics back then were all about fear-based, the egg in the pan, this is your brain on drugs.
Melting into the couch.
Exactly. And like the stern talking to with the kid and the father was on drugs too. And so, and they did that thing, which I think is what is actually the gateway thing with cannabis is it lumped it in with all these other hard drugs, which is what happens when things are illicit. You go to the dealer who has all the goods, So I do not think cannabis is a gateway drug. I think it's an off-ramp. And I actually have some great testimonials in my life from people about that. But that's how I was on the DARE campaign or DARE thing. But it's also kind of how I got to thinking differently about cannabis legalization and reform. And that was the big thing we used to work on when I was on the board of Marijuana Policy Project and participating hand in hand with SSDP and the importance of education and all of these things, because I don't think any of us got into this endeavor to legalize and decriminalize cannabis to make it for kids. That's not what we're doing here.
Well, it's a really fascinating, I think, parallel to what brands in cannabis are looking to do. They ultimately are trying to expand the addressable market of people that are going to come into the industry and try a product, even if they might not be a cannabis consumer from high school or from college. So I'm curious, what in your experience, working with these huge, well-known brands that have, such incredible penetration to the various markets they're in, has transferred over into this process of cannabis strands trying to be more normalized? How does Pepsi relate to can and trying to, get that beverage to be more accepted? Like, how has that experience transferred over for you?
Yeah, so I was always working with my clients in that instance on new product development or on thinking about how to talk to new consumer segments. And sometimes it wasn't the consumer segment that was the natural consideration for them. So I'll give you a couple of examples. One was, for example, American Express, well-known brand. But, one of the things that we were always thinking about when working with them is looking at untapped customers. And one of the customer bases that they were actually very deficient in relative to other card companies is females. So just kind of working with them and to understanding that women are spending gatekeepers of the household, decision makers around that, getting them to understand how to participate in their wallet as a tool for everyday use, not just for like special occasions. And so, that starts to train your brain to look differently at the world and thinking about consumer behavior. It's the same thing. With PepsiCo, one of the projects I worked on was in the orange juice aisle. Orange juice had been maligned during the Atkins and
Oh,
all of that.
yes.
And everybody was blaming orange juice on obesity in America. And I was like, that's not the problem. But, orange juice nonetheless took a ding. And, we had to think about how people think about the way that they live their lives, where they're spending their caloric spend and all of those things. And also what it's like to shop for orange juice in the section. So I would go with people to stores and have breakfast with them and try to understand all of these things. So how does that dovetail into cannabis is that, I was out here in California, I just moved here from New York, and I saw people waiting in line for brick and mortar, and they looked like all of us on here or like anyone we know. It didn't look like what the anti-drug campaigns would tell you. And normal folks shopping for cannabis and waiting in line at a brick and mortar location when everything else is going digital. And I think all the training and doing all of that work and thinking about new product development, talking to new consumer segments, thinking about people who are underserved in terms of product offerings or marketing and communications, that's what made me take a second look at what was going on with California in that time. So that was like 2011. So I think a kind of a training of being curious and open-minded about things that kind of got me here. And then, now, and Morgan and the guys will tell you, like Colin, Patrick, like I have been following the analog categories of consumer product trends as well as Bev Elk for years as a work vis-a-vis cannabis and what's happening with how the consumer spending in those categories, what's happening with this big trend shift away from alcohol, and where is that being displaced to? So all of those things are all a part of that prior background.
I mean, just to maybe piggyback off that a little bit, where do you think that a lot of that spend is going to be displaced into cannabis? It seems like the alcohol companies are hopping on to the hemp beverage train. Do you think that that is ultimately a pipeline that we're going to see? Is that going to be the, Starbucks moment for cannabis brands where they become a much more sort of household known thing because they're in these points of distribution that are more commonly associated with alcohol, which we're more comfortable consuming maybe?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think you just hit on it is it's like the access points are more normalized. The way that people consume beverages in social settings is entirely normalized at this point. We consume, I mean, Jake, last time I saw you, we had coffee. It's like beverages, you share meals. In our cannabis culture, people do share cannabis and the very, like, you pass you to the left and you do all
Mhm.
these things like don't overheard things. There's different, like, ways around consuming cannabis that we all follow, but I think drinks are far less stigmatized, almost to the point where it's like it is shocking to me when someone will say like, "Oh, would you like tell your niece that you work in cannabis?" I'm like, "She's 5, so she doesn't need to know what I do at all. She knows I go to work, but yet I'll be drinking a glass of wine in front of her." It's an interesting kind of paradox of a society that we live in. But back to your original question, do I think that it gets displaced to cannabis? I think it's an opportunity to get displaced to cannabis. That people are coming of age, meaning 21 and plus, with a wallet and a share of wallet that was once dedicated to alcohol now can be dedicated to cannabis. And I think because it's so substantially legal across all of these states, that's a very real consideration. I think it does not surprise me that Bev would jump into the beverage category because that's definitely their wheelhouse. And I was just sitting with a wine and spirits executive at lunch yesterday, and we were talking about the challenges around beverage because of the weight, the volume, all of the
Mhm.
various logistical aspects of it that have made it harder for the cannabis companies in the technical regulated verticals that we have to just even do that with a positive gross margin. It makes it very difficult. Whereas if you're distributing into like a Total Wine and Spirits, or if you're a cider company that is already distributing cider and you figured out how to do an intoxicating hemp beverage, you've already got that infrastructure that lends itself to beverage and the nuances of that. And I do think, and I hope that that's another way that if it's done right, will help to kind of bring down the stigma around cannabis. If people are like, "Oh, I'm enjoying this drink, maybe I might enjoy some other things," and we could use that as a platform to introduce them to other product types. But I'm not sure it's a pure offset into our world, but
Mm,
I do think there is a lot of it because you can see our data is growing as an industry
mhm.
and theirs is declining as an industry on a wholesale level. So I think that's encouraging.
Yeah, how is the rise of the hemp market and the hemp beverage market and all of this spend that's not going through liquor stores or through our dispensaries where we can kind of see that spike that you're alluding to? Like, has that been, was that a little bit forecasted in your mind, or did you see that coming a few years ago? Because it seems totally out of nowhere that this loophole has been exploited and we're just seeing, grocery
Yeah.
stores and convenience stores in some markets just caution to the wind and stocking, real, for all intents and purposes, THC rich products.
Yeah. I guess because I've seen this cycle before with I'll just use CBD as an analog.
Mhm.
CBD, was it like
Mm.
2017 when that thing was like a bubble exploding and there were like multiple companies getting ready to IPO at $1 billion, and I think every single one of them does not exist anymore. And like you could see like what happened with Charlotte's Web, which is they have such a great origin story as a
Hey.
company around Charlotte Figge and the importance. I think that her story, and she was such a brave little girl, and I think that story was really important to the industry. So I don't want to, but I do think the CBD thing did kind of go through this arc. I think we could see something like that again because there's the companies like Charlotte's Web that do follow protocols, quality control, and quality assurance. And I think that's a certain thing. But then you have a lot of companies that are not following those same guidelines. I mean, like Charlotte's Web, even because they were public and everything, like they even had to be careful about the claims they were making. They were following
Mm.
all the rules. But we know there were a lot of CBD companies at that time that weren't upholding those same standards. I think we're seeing that again in the intoxicating hemp space. So, I think right now it's going to be a little gritty and a little messy and hard to pin down what's actually happening in that category as a trend because of all of the ways it's being sold. And it's being sold in vape shops. And a lot of times they're not age verifying. So that's also tricky. So that's also not like a true representation of what an adult use intoxicating hemp market could look like as like an adjacent market to our regulated cannabis market. So I do think we could go through a bit of a boom bust cycle, and I'll tell you a couple why. I get a pitch for a hemp beverage in my inbox at least a couple times a day. And most of these decks, when I open them, they I was like, are you all using the same AI robot to just thing or the same agency? I don't know. It all looks the same and the
Yeah,
names are
really,
just like
you find the design language is really similar across them.
yes. Yeah, like if you see it, it's asking to be disrupted with somebody doing something, really exciting and
Totally.
different category. Okay, so in wine and spirits, seltzer. So White Claw popped through. And what happened? Everybody launched it. And if you look at all the data, a lot of them did not do well. And the latecomers really struggled because the shelf space got super competitive and crowded. And I think I would say probably like 3 or 4 of them have remained like punched ahead. And then other ones, like if you hear the earnings calls with some of those companies, it's like that. Yeah, it's like not a great outcome. Same thing with the cocktails in a can. So where are we? So I think what we're going to see here is a similar kind of boom bust. I think we'll see some groups running ahead, but the number one thing about beverage is your work is never done. It's why the cola wars exist. Like you have to continue to innovate in every possible way, not just in formulations, but also how you're talking to the consumer, where you're making sure you're inserted. So I think it's exciting, but I think it's just going to be a really interesting thing. And I'm just hoping that at some way it becomes a little bit more regulated so that it's just we know that what's in it is safe for people and that kids aren't getting their hands on it. And that's really, I mean, if we can just start there, I would be happy on that front. So
I just saw an article last week about a teacher who got the Mountain Dew Baja Blasts. It has a spiked seltzer, and the teacher got a bunch of packs of those for her students, her fifth graders' graduation, and got her whole classroom of fifth graders drunk. And I looked up the packaging, and it looked just like Baja Blast that you'd get at Taco Bell, Mountain Dew, but with a slightly edgier look to it, but totally indistinguishable, and probably was being sold right next to normal Baja Blast in a can. Non-cannabis, alcohol-specific kind of analog to point to in how kind of prevalent that can be. So yeah, you're speaking about brand as a moat and just like how crowded these spaces are getting. What are signals, I guess, to you that brand and that moat are lacking? I feel like there's a lot of intangibles of what great can look like, but is there anything to you that just is like an immediate, cookie cutter? There's nothing here.
well, I mean, a lot of it is tied to the people at the beginning, right? Like, so you can see the treatment and yeah, that looks nice. But if you dig in, the big warning signs go off for me when someone says, like, this happens actually more than you would think. We're creating the first beverage for women.
I was gonna say the first one for soccer moms, like, people have tried, believe me.
And I'm like, that is not true. So what does that say? I feel like you haven't done your market research. You haven't done your competitive landscape analysis. And this is a competitive landscape. So the analysis is due and deserved. I think a lot of people don't necessarily also understand what a full brand is. I think you guys have a really interesting perspective from where you sit at Sparkplug because you help people to talk about brands and products. And part of that is to have a fulsome picture of what that means. But I think, when I think back to some of the greats, which are obvious, is like a Red Bull. So Red Bull is not just a drink, but it's a lifestyle. And they didn't just go get a celebrity. They tied it to people who became kind of celebrities in their own right because they were so cool and kick ass in the thing that they did, which was a part of the Red Bull lifestyle. So that is a fully fledged, thought out kind of a brand idea. And I think that's one of the things that when I don't see that and I don't see a fully thought out brand idea, because this is a day and age with all of the information people have, with all of the ways we tie affinities to things online and in person, a fully fledged brand is one people can sink their teeth into and identify with it. And so I don't identify with this liqueur. It's just what they had at the store. But if they had bubbly, I would buy it because I like it more. Although I think it's supposed to be worse for you because of whatever's inside. But the point being, what is this? This is seltzer. All I care about is seltzer. I don't care that it's liqueur or whatever else it is I'm drinking. And this is a danger that people found in the craft beer category. I'll never forget. I was sat in on a panel and the guys were talking about the consumer developed an interest in West Coast IPA. They didn't develop an interest in Lagunitas or Ballast Point or blah, 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 unless you have a unique formulation and identifying brand tenants that made people feel like they wanted to sink into it. They had an affinity for the product, not the brand. And I think those are the things I look for, Jake, when I'm like deciding immediately if something's not going to get another click. I'll give these guys a shout out because I think they had like a pretty fully fledged idea as the Minneapolis Cider Company guys. And they came up with this company. And this is not a portfolio company. I just like it. They came up with a product called Day Trip. What I liked about it is like these guys had a point of view on cider and on the experience they created in the tap room around it. And they figured out that people who came to the cider tap room were tended to be like outdoorsy people and like to travel. And so then when they created this second line, and they too, I thought were very interesting because they had all of that beverage experience. They created this line that's supposed to be kind of for that person who's like, we go hiking, we go,
Day trips.
mountain biking. And yeah, day tripping. And so it was like, okay, that's cool. And I think it like really, you could tell it was like thought out for the people and designed for the people who they know and that they understand through their other verticals. And I thought that was pretty smart.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting breakdown of how the experience of a brand goes so far beyond the actual experience of consuming the product. It's where you feel comfortable consuming the product, what circle you feel comfortable bringing it into. I probably wouldn't, when I lived in Boulder, have, rolled up to the backyard barbecue with a 6-pack of White Claws. I want to roll up.
I would have.
The cool, yeah, you would have. Yeah, unfortunately, I would have rolled up with, this interesting IPA from this local spot that has this branding that really feels like this and
It's
that.
like a little revisionist history. I don't remember it quite that way. You being so cool, but
I was more of a sours guy. Yeah, I had to have something.
I like sours. I'll say
it. Yeah, I mean, I think Red Bull is the ultimate example where literally experience of Red Bull is not even drinking Red Bull. 90% of the time, watching the Red Bull F1 team. It's watching this, Red Bull sponsored skydiver jump out of a plane with no parachute and, have his buddies bring him a parachute in the sky with a Red Bull.
And a can of Red Bull.
Yeah, like it's the experience goes so far beyond it. And I feel like,
fun fact, they often fill those with water, those cans. And those athletes are frequently not actually drinking Red Bull while doing the slalom, Lindsey Vonn. But
it's all about the experience.
It's water, but it's all about the experience, the illusion.
It's all about the vision. Yeah.
Maybe a little bit of a kind of shift here. How do you think that translates into retail spaces for cannabis? Because it does feel like we're very early innings for experience in cannabis. We've got a couple of standouts that have done a good job of making a, like you mentioned, Day Trip or maybe, a company like Wana that has been just the early gummy company to do it making gummies, but hasn't necessarily created like a holistic brand experience. Do you feel like retail's at the same stage in cannabis? Are there retailers that have really created that indelibly good experience yet, or are we still kind of in the process of figuring out what that looks like?
Yeah, I do think, well, okay, so I should qualify that every market has such a different retail experience. Like, for example, here in SF, we're allowed to get a little basket. Like when I go to Spark, I can go get my basket and go pick out all my goodies and put them in the basket. And by the way, which increases basket sizes almost universally. What are the two things? The open shopping plan and being able to use digital payment. So,
wow.
Yeah, even better credit, but we don't have that really.
We'll get there. We'll get there eventually.
So it depends on the market, but I think again, it comes down to a defined consumer brand concept of what you're trying to offer in your retail. So I think there are some stores that try to be kind of that more medical store I think there's some stores that try to have more of like maybe a farmer's market vibe. And then I think there's some stores that have tried to go more of the high tech, like Apple store. But all of those things, right? When people say that, and I shouldn't be so critical of it, when people say it's like shopping in an Apple store, I think what they're saying is it feels familiar and comfortable to me. So, like in psychology, there's this whole thing called familiarity bias, right? And it's why when people run a lot of advertisements, all of a sudden you'll be like, oh, I like them. And it's because you're familiar with them. And so the same thing goes for a shopping experience. If it feels more like going to Whole Foods, when it was like kind of like a great, or like Wegmans, for anybody who knows, like a great shopping experience that you're familiar with. I think that's an immediate win. But I think if you're gonna like do retail right, you do in this market because it is so competitive and people are so price sensitive in cannabis. I think you do want to have a little something for everybody, but I think you can have a point of view about what that something for everybody is. I think an interesting shop is that shop called The Woods, which is owned by Woody Harrelson and Bill Maher, and there's one other fella in there. But like their point of view is to have cannabis that's like kind of local small brands from throughout the state. And so they try to highlight that. And I think you can do that at different price points and different offerings from those companies. And so that retail experience has a point of view of what it's doing. It's being kind of a curator of those smaller types of brands and companies. And I think that's an important thing. In Florida, and I will talk my book on this, we have, and Sunburn is a pretty well thought out brand. I have to give props to this because I do think it's a well thought out brand.
Yeah.
It's named after the founder's father. He was a big trafficker of cannabis back in
Nice.
the late 70s, early 80s from Cartagena into Florida. And the federal case against him was called Project Sunburn. And so
No
on the
way. That's
walls,
so cool.
so good. And on the walls of the dispensaries, there's like images of big newspaper articles. The receipts have the newspaper articles from the time printed on the back.
Wow.
There's like little tidbits in each of the stores about Bill Cobb. The products are named for him. There's a lot of winks and nods to that. At some of the openings, they had some of the federal agents present who like shook the mayor's hand. Yeah, the guy in jail, but like showed up. And so when people go into that store, you have that whole kind of thing around you, and I like it because it harkens back to the history of cannabis, which was that it wasn't legal, but that we're taking our own claim on it here now. But their whole focus, because Bill was a connoisseur of cannabis and a selector, bringer inner of it, distributor of it, they've focused on quality. And so even though Florida is a heavily value driven market and we do have value product lines in the tiering of the products, the focus is very much on getting to quality and getting to quality concentrates and flour. So like that's a strong point of view, and it's one that you just try to hold on to. And there's ways to be smart about it, but there's other fun concepts like the travel agency in New York is a fun
Yes.
concept.
Yeah, I just went to
Although,
the Soho location last week.
yeah, and it's like fun. You're kind of
Totally.
traveling. Okay. But I did say I told the doorman he missed a moment because he was like, "Can I see your ID?" I was like, "Don't you mean my passport?" And he was like, "Huh?" I was like, "No, missed opportunity." Like,
Well, it's funny you say that because all around Soho in the weeks beforehand, they had travel agency folks walking around handing out boarding passes that were little like travel agency boarding passes that had a little, scan for a special discount. And it was great. I felt like they had created sort of a holistic experience of, oh, I get what they're about. They're doing something that's kind of cute and fun. They've got a bit of a like retro cool vibe to it. Yeah, I think that point of view piece I keep coming back to because, I don't naturally come from, I would say, like the world of brands or the world of sort of brand stories. I think that's something that you obviously and, Jake in our duo is much more sort of the thinker on. But when I hear about the Sunburn story, it's like, oh, that tracks so well because not only does it have the history to it, but it also has this thing that I feel like the legalization of cannabis has actually taken away a little bit, which is like the edge. There's so many people who thought consuming cannabis was more a part of their personal brand or their personality because it was anti-establishment, it was against the rules, and creating an environment where you can feel like we're, against the rules, but within the rules still that's a hard tightrope to walk, and that sounds like a really cool way to do it. I really like that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too, because we're trying with a lot of our communications to have that edge as a part of it. And some of that edge is also being playful, but in like a little bit of a raunchier way. It's like sun's out, buns out, it's Florida. Like, blah, blah, blah. So it's fun to I do feel like because this industry is so hard and because the regulatory environment is so challenging and arduous, and we don't have the support and infrastructure that a lot of other industries have around it, you can lose sight of it. But when you drill into it, it's like what we're doing here could be truly fun. And so I think brands also have to keep reminding us of that. That's part of their job in our ecosystem. And that comes in the form of a retail experience or in the products you're selling on the shelves.
Totally. And I think it is so necessary in a product space that can so easily be characterized by commodification. And these, can, for a lot of consumers, it is all about THC percent. But I think the entire industry, retailers and brands, are tasked right now with finding other variables to play with and to invest in and to define themselves around that are not just, the ratio between THC and dollars, not just that intoxicating value, but all those other intangibles. Are there any businesses or retailers that are doing anything with community that you see that's really unique, or loyalty maybe, or anything with brands and like flavor, or the terpene universe it's a whole thing?
I think that comes down to a couple of things. I think the e-com platform can help people to guide to understand like how they want to think. Like, as you go to new markets, like in California, I'm like a full-blown terp girl. Like I know which terpenes I really, really like. And I don't even look at the sativa indica thing anymore because I just know
Yeah.
what terpenes I'm looking for. But yet you go to New Jersey and it's like not a leading discussion point. That's one of the things that the way your e-com experience or your merchandising in store or how you create like need states is an annoying word that we used when I was working with CVS, for example, on merchandising and retail experiences around their private label brands. That was an interesting study, but a little bit is helping people frame how they think about it. Like, okay, so a lot of people like wouldn't know what we know, which is CBN is super helpful and if you're sleepy, or like purple strains tend to be helpful when you want to be sleepy. A lot of people don't know that. So what do we need to do? We need to create like basket or like categorization of products in different form factors so people have different ways they can access it, but help them to understand it and then they will become informed. I think your point about potency is a really good one. It's funny because I'm actually usually looking for a little less torque in my cannabis because I like brunch weed is pretty cool to me, but like and do not necessarily need to like knock myself out. But I think we're still a ways away from that. So it's almost like the table stakes are the potency, and then you've got the sativa indica thing, and then you've got the terpenes. So it's like we're kind of leveling up with that information. So I think but where you guys live, which is really, really important, is helping the bud tenders. And the way I think about this actually dovetails into the alcohol, specifically wine category, which we have Napa and Sonoma just north of me. Napa was always known for their big boozy Cabernets, right? And then their big oaky butter bomb Chardonnay. And then people were just like, that's what we're going for. And that's the send. And it was up to the people who were leading the tasting rooms to help people to understand there's more wines. There's like Petit Verdot. There's all these other things you can experience. And so then you can see the palate base of the consumer spreading. But that had a lot to do with the kind of the education, either in wine and bottle shops throughout the country or in these like tasting rooms or from sommeliers in restaurants. But all of those things are how you disseminate information. And then people become informed. They love to inform their friends. So now you have in Sonoma, for example, a lot of wines are a lot of lower alcohol content. Again, this shift in consumer behavior. And it's like all of these smaller varietals of wine that are now more drought resistant and better in low water conditions. So the consumer trends are shifting, but I would say that's large in part to do with the people cultivating the wine and understanding the shifting landscape, but also the gatekeepers of the knowledge, which are the tasting room people, the bottle shop sommeliers, the bartenders. And I feel like where you guys live, that's really important to our industry because we need bud tenders or retail associates who are better conduits to inform the consumer base in the point of sale, right? And by the way, doing so within kind of the brand tenets or vibes of where they're working, they're representing. So, I mean, I think that's a really important thing. And then you inform people, and then they become able to inform people, and it becomes a whole virtuous cycle. So, I think like where Sparkplug sits, and I'm talking my book, but I really do mean that. If you think about it, it's critical. I mean, this is also how I learned so much about tequila, for God's sake.
Totally.
When you guys were talking about going to a cookout, like that's what I'm bringing for everybody, so.
Especially considering how handcuffed brands are in reaching customers outside of a store setting, without commercials or magazine spreads or billboards or so many of the traditional tools of, just back to your point on familiarity, just building up that presence, are just totally inaccessible.
Yeah. Yeah, and people are gonna come in for their kind of their table stakes items, like a lot of people do. They'll just be like, "I gotta get my CBN gummies, I gotta get." But, like, how do we keep them coming back? And it's by surprising and delighting them on other things, and then their basket becomes more diversified, and the basket becomes better, and then you can reach them on new touch points and all those things, so it's really important.
Well, I'm curious on the point of the tasting room. Where do you see that next frontier of consumption experience going? Because I feel like since we got in the industry in 2017, we've been hearing about how next year is when consumption lounges are really going to blow up. That's going to be the next frontier of cannabis. And it's just never been. I don't feel like I've ever heard about a consumption lounge really landing on its feet and succeeding, whether that's for a regulatory reason or for just effective go to market and getting traffic from customers. So I'm curious what your take is on the kind of consumption side for cannabis, which feels like, based on what you're saying, kind of an important part of the flywheel of getting people to understand what cannabis they like and how it's going to ultimately affect their purchasing behavior.
Yeah. I think consumption lounges are difficult because now you're getting into like restaurant and hospitality business, which is an incredibly difficult business. That's why restaurants turn over so much. But I think the way the regulators have conceived of these things has been very limiting and very challenging. So, they had GTI was like a pioneer of this in Mundelein, I believe is where their first lounge was. But I think they were even limited in terms of non-cannabis, even non-alcohol things you could serve in there alongside allowing people to consume in a social setting. Lounges have an interesting origin, which out here in California, they would allow for sections within dispensaries to do it. Like I remember we had it at Spark on Mission. And part of that was also to contemplate that people aren't able, because of at that time, the status of cannabis, maybe they couldn't consume it in their homes because they lived in an apartment building. Or if people live in government housing, they certainly cannot or are not supposed to consume cannabis on premise. So having a space where people can consume socially and safely is actually almost more of just like an inclusion and making sure everybody's safe around it. It's an interesting history when you think about it, but where it exists today is like we're trying to make it into a social setting so that people can learn more about it, experience it in a setting like that. And I just think the regulators have continued to make it very hard. And the investor dollars for that reason have been difficult to flow into that. But what I think could be really interesting, and this is where I think this hemp beverage thing could be helpful to our industry, is you go to a concert. So like GTI with Senorita did that deal with the Shed. It's an indoor outdoor venue. So they have indoor in the winter, outdoor in the summer. And like in the summertime, you just see the Chicago skyline. Everybody brought whatever they brought in to consume it at a concert because everybody's always smoked weed at a concert.
Yeah.
For like history of humanity. But so I think that's interesting. But lounges, I would love to see them have more of a moment. I'm just not sure when that's going to happen.
I wouldn't put it past, I guess I don't know what the regulatory situation is in New York with on-premise consumption, but I wouldn't put it past somebody really cracking the format in New York where it's higher traffic, there's more of that buzz generation potential, and maybe being able to go a little bit wide with that if they can establish a foothold brand in the way that, you'll see a restaurant or coffee shop concept like Maman be able to get a good location in near Union Square, and then suddenly they're in DC, and suddenly they're in Charlotte, and suddenly they're all over.
Paired with an activity like Top Golf or something like that. I just really have a hard time for some reason picturing this cannabis consumption lounge of a bunch of strangers just hanging
Just
out,
sitting
like,
around.
just
Yeah.
sitting around. Yeah, but I agree.
The
I think
Alamo
that
Smokehouse. Maybe it's a movie theater. We can make a little
there's something
partnership
to
over
that
there.
for sure.
I love that. I've been waiting. I was just gonna say that. I've been waiting for Alamo to do. They did a 420 thing. They
Oh,
do a
cool.
420 thing every year. Yeah, it's cool, but it doesn't include consumption. I
Right.
think they just assume people come
Yeah.
by a lot.
Exactly.
Yeah, true.
Cool. Well, before we let you go, any predictions for the cannabis industry in 5 years? Anything that we're going to be surprised by that we just can't see now, but counting on you to see around that corner and tell us.
I think it's feasible that we're gonna see a kind of a bifurcation of product categories across the United States, and I think that I could see BevAlc kind of taking a hold of this hemp beverage category from a distribution and kind of regulation front. I don't know how that's gonna happen, but I could see it happening, and I would be just fine with that. I think that then we could see a nice crossover into our markets, but I do think we're gonna see a bit of a consolidation on the vertical operating side, which is already happening. But I'm hoping that what that does is then enable some efficiencies to free up to continue to create more brands and to reinvest into the retail consumer experience so that the next wave of where this goes is a more refined point of view about this as a fully baked cannabis or consumer category, because we're a consumer product category just like anything else at this point. We just live in a regulated silo, but I don't see why we can't approach it more like another consumer product category at this point. So I think there's going to be a whole nother wave of brands and conceptual experiences around cannabis going into the future. So that'll be cool.
Well, we're
I love it.
excited
Sounds
to
exciting to
ride
me.
the wave with you. Yeah. All right. Emily Paxhia is the co-founder and managing partner of Poseidon, one of the longest running investment firms focused on the cannabis industry. She's been investing in cannabis since 2013 and remains one of the sharpest voices on brand, strategy, and experience in the space. Thank you, Emily, for being with us.
Thank you.